Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our Grand Rounds speaker today. And we have a long tradition of having our fourth-year residents present a Grand Rounds during their final year. And many of our best presentations over the years, in fact, have come from our residents. And I'm sure today will be no exception. Our speaker today is Dr. Juan Pablo Galindo. Dr. Galindo is a fourth-year resident here at our program. He has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Williams College. Some of you may know that is one of the most exclusive small schools in the United States. Not easy to get into. Congratulations, Dr. Galindo. And I believe played soccer there. He also is a graduate of the A.T. Still University School of Osteopathic Medicine in Arizona in 2014. He's worked extensively with troubled youth, has worked in soccer as a coach and mentor, and here at U of L has been recognized in a number of ways, not the least of which is the winner of the Martin L. Grossman Award as Outstanding Resident in Consult Liaison Psychiatry. Probably there aren't too many people here that remember Dr. Grossman. He was a very outstanding resident who passed away much too soon, and he's much missed, and it's a great honor to win the award in his name. Dr. Galindo also was one of those people of whom I'm very envious. A few of our attendings and many of our students and residents fall into this category. That's someone who's truly, completely fluent in more than one language. And for those of us who strive to do that, that's not easy to do. I'm also reminded by Christy, for those attendings here who need to claim credit, nowadays they have a midnight deadline. So there's a piece of paper out there that has the number, and it's in small print there. So don't forget to call and get your credit for this. I also have one editorial comment for today. In my role as chair, I'm involved in lots of various committees, organizations, leadership groups, and I can tell you that U of L has been in the papers. We've had a rough time. I'll also remind you that U of L has been around for 200 years. We have an irreplaceable position in the community to educate students of the health sciences and in every other area of human endeavor. And we take care of needy people who would not otherwise get care and provide a crucial service to this community, and we're not going anywhere. So keep your pride in your organization because we do lots of good things in the world. So with that having been said, Dr. Galindo.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Casey, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. So, let's see. So I am Juan Pablo Galindo, and this is my Grand Rounds MDMA, The Tale of Three Journeys. So let's get started. So the most important slide of the whole thing here, the disclosure slide. I have no conflicts of interest nor financial incentives to disclose. Outlines and objectives are pretty simple. So just to learn about the history, pharmacology, and future applications of MDMA to treat mental illness, and most importantly, it's just to have fun. So let's meet the cast, the tale of three journeys. So first up, we have Rick Doblin, PhD, founder and executive director of MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. Next, we have James Casey, Army medic who served in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2012. And lastly, we got this guy. So that's me. And some say I still have the same haircut every now and then. Put it to the rocking the soccer ball at a very young age. So let's start our adventure and go back in time and start from the beginning. So our journey begins in 1912 in a small town in Germany. Chemist Anton Kolich was trying to synthesize an analog to hydrastinine in the Merck Pharmaceutical Laboratory. So hydrastinine is a semi-synthetic alkaloid from the hydrolysis of the alkaloid hydrastine, which is found in the plant golden seal. So Kolich was trying to avoid the existing patent held by Bayer of hydrastine, as they were using it as a hemostatic drug at the time. Of note, Golden Seal is also the title of this movie, The Golden Seal, released in 1983, which is when this guy was born. So, coincidence? I don't know. So on a fateful Christmas Eve, Merck Laboratory filed for a patent of an intermediate compound in the synthesis of methylhydracinine. So this is the actual copy of the patent that was filed with a beautiful little German crest there. And in doing so, MDMA was formally introduced to the world. So you would think it'd be one of these molecules drawn up here, but because it was just an intermediate compound, it's hidden, and there it is right there. So now that we found this molecule, you're thinking, great Scott, like what do we do with this? But this wasn't the case, as you'll soon find out. So here's the star of the grand rounds and the focus of our discussion, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, also known as MDMA. So you're asking yourself after the big discovery, so then what happened? Well, nothing really. It was sort of forgotten about and shoved away for many years to come. Not until 1953 did the United States Army commission a study of the toxicity and behavioral effects in animals injected with mescaline and several analogs, which included MDMA. Then in 1965, American chemist and psychopharmacologist Alexander Shulgin reported that he synthesized MDMA for Dow Chemical Company, but at that time he did not test the psychoactivity of the compound. So now we've traveled to 1953, and this is when Rick Doblin was born, and he was raised on the shores of Lake Michigan. His father was a pediatrician, and he was described as a smallish, well-proportioned boy. He had tight brown curls and the concerns of a 40-year-old. In 1970, he enrolled in a non-traditional private liberal arts college in Florida called New College. And like any good student in the 70s, he became politically involved and took his first dose of LSD. After his first LSD experience, Rick stated that his experience humbled him, that he'd been swept up in the 60s idea of a new generation rising, and believed that much of the blame for its failure had to do with the arrogance of its leaders. He decided that if anyone intended to change the world, they would have to change themselves first, to find the tendrils of their culture's self-destructiveness deep inside and root them out. He then went to his college counselor and said, I'm on the verge of dropping out. I'm not really sure how to handle these LSD experiences, but I think that they're important. So what was going on in my life in the 70s? So obviously I wasn't born yet, but my parents were around, Gustavo and Elizabeth, and here's my dad posing next to some statue he's probably not supposed to be touching, rocking those bell bottoms. And there's my parents in Mexico City, and my dad riding our faithful steed, Panchito. It's a little burro there. So, as we saw, MDMA's discovery kind of went unnoticed for many years, and it took Sasha Shulgin his endless curiosity to rediscover it. So this is Sasha Shulgin. He was a Dow pharmaceutical chemist, and he synthesized MDMA in 1965 while experimenting with other compounds. And it wasn't until September of 1976 that he first tested its psychoactive effects on himself. He was instrumental to the FDA by helping them identify and classify potential drugs of abuse by testing them on himself. So he was sort of like this guinea pig. They would just test all this stuff, and then he'd be like, oh, this might be abused. So Shulgin initially took 81 milligrams and described his experience as 53 minutes, smooth shift into light intoxication, blended very well into cocktail hour. And at a later date, he took 120 milligrams, and his experience was quite different. As the material came on, I felt I was being enveloped, and my attention had to be directed to it. I became quite fearful. Then the fear started to leave me, and I could try taking baby steps. I'm afraid to face the mountains, for fear they will overpower me. But I did look, and I'm astounded. I feel totally peaceful. I have lived all my life to get here, and I feel I have come home. And in that moment, he became Thug Life. So soon thereafter, Sasha Shulgin shared his unique substance with his wife, Anne, who then described her experience in the following video taken from a documentary called MDMA, the movie. So I'm going to share her experience with you guys.
he gave me, I forget what the dosage was, probably 100 milligrams, which is a good initial dose. And asked me if I wanted his company, and I said no, I'd like to wander around and find out, what it did, and explore it by myself, and I would ask his help if I needed it. So I went outside and sat for a while and went through the initial rush, that strange feeling that we all fall in love with after a while, which is always a strange feeling. And what it did was it opened me up to who and what I was, and it gave me compassion for myself, instead of being continually aware of the things I'd failed to do and the things I was not good at. I realized that I was a treasure and I was of value. And I felt, and I wrote this down in the book, PGY4. I felt as if I were held in the hands of God, with infinite love. And I cried quite a lot.
So that's a pretty compelling experience that Anne Shulgin described. And Shulgin, it was the first one that gave MDMA its first nickname, and he called it Window, because he thought it allowed users to strip away habits and perceive the world clearly. So he knew that many psychologists and psychiatrists had been using other psychedelics as a tool in psychotherapy, but he also knew about the unpredictable and sometimes frightening effects of these drugs. This can be described by the following quote I found during my research. In MDMA, he found a drug that seemed to simply dissolve problems without bizarre shifts in perspective. In the end, there had only been profound peace, total acceptance that lingered long after the drug wore off. So switching gears here now, I'm going to go into the psychopharmacology of MDMA. So MDMA first enters the monoamine neurons by acting as a transport substrate. Its activity is then seen on the VMAT receptors on the vesicles, and this causes the vesicles to just release the neurotransmitters that are held inside. Then MDMA changes direction of the SERT transporter and starts pumping the serotonin out into the synapse, while at the same time it also prevents its uptake. So this causes a tremendous surge of serotonin to enter the synapse and activate serotonin receptors. Of note, MDMA has 10 times more affinity at serotonin transporters compared to dopamine and norepinephrine, and consequently has mainly serotonergic effects. Additionally, there's also a great increase in oxytocin as well. So now I'll go over the psychoactive effects. So MDMA users begin reporting subjective effects within 30 to 60 minutes of consumption. So those of you that had the pepperoni pizza, you'll probably start feeling something in about 10 or 15 minutes. Hold on to your seat, Hassan. So most people describe euphoria, sociability, and feelings of communication being easy or simple, a sense of inner peace, enhanced sensation, and an altered sense of time. Some of the physical effects include hyperthermia, increased heart rates, loss of appetite, visual and auditory hallucinations, which are pretty rare unless you take a huge dose, or in mydriasis. So I highlighted bruxism here. So in the rave culture, it's common to see people with pacifiers. And at first glance, you would think this is like really weird. I don't know why these people are wearing or like sucking on pacifiers. and you would think it's just a fad. But however, it serves a purpose. So MDMA users sometimes use these to suck on to prevent themselves from grinding their teeth. So it's not just some weird thing, it actually has a purpose. The next question is MDMA addictive. So in the DSM-5, there is other hallucinogen use disorder, and this lumps in LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, DMT. And now I'm going to quote from the DSM. Of all substance use disorders, hallucinogen disorder is one of the rarest. 12-month prevalence of 0.1% among adults 18 and older. And just for comparison, we have alcohol at 8.5, opiates 0.37, and sedatives 0.2%. So this slide is for all you chemistry nerds out there. So pay very close attention. I'm going to go into precise detail on how MDMA is made. So first you have to go to your neighborhood Kroger and you find this guy. Then you take him home and you get some eggs, put them in the oven, and voila, ecstasy at your hands. It's my own version of the ecstasy. Just ask my fiance, the funfetti. All right. So once Shogun first tried MDMA on himself, the word spread. He introduced it to a well-known psychotherapist named Leo Zeth, who is known for using psychoactive substances in therapy. So Zeth popularized it in psychotherapeutic communities, dubbing it Atom. So its next nickname from Window is now Atom, because he believed it returned one to a state of primordial innocence. So Zeth then actually traveled the world, and it's estimated that he trained around 4,000 psychotherapists in the therapeutic use of MDMA. And at that same time, MDMA found its home in dance culture. And as early as the 1970s, there were reports in Chicago crime labs that people were using MDMA recreationally in the club scene. Okay, so it's 1982. So what else was going around that time? So after Rick's profound experience with LSD in college, he became interested in the potential of psychedelics and therapy. And in 1982, he first tried MDMA. And he wrote, "I just thought this potential is amazing. It helped you to trust in the process of opening up and to see that even with difficult things, feeling them and integrating them was the better choice, the better thing." So in 1983, yours truly was born in Mexico City. And then we moved to Lake Tahoe in 1989. So there's my mom and my brother. And we were on the ski team rocking our neon late 80s gear. So what else is going on in the late 80s? So this is around the time that MDMA finds its home. So not only did MDMA find a potential use for therapy, but it also seemed to go hand in hand with a new electronic dance scene emerging in the late 80s and early 90s. So it was at that time that the pressed MDMA pill with unique colors and designs started to emerge, made by different underground chemists. It was like their calling card. And in my research, I read how when MDMA first hit the scene, all the rage was about this guy, the White Dove, which was primarily sold in Texas at the Dallas nightclub known as Stark. So why did MDMA find its home in dance music of all places? So Rick actually gave a great explanation of this in an Atlantic magazine article linking MDMA and the rave culture. So he wrote, "The link between drugs and spirituality comes from two fundamental human needs: the needs for rituals that connect us with others, and the need to operate with the full range of consciousness." So as word spread on MDMA, we can trend the amount of first-time users from this National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So you can see that in the early 80s, there was a sort of a plateau of use, and then around 1996, the use spiked for first-time users, reaching a peak of nearly 2 million users in 2001. So by the end of the 1990s, the DEA actually estimated that only 40% of what was sold on the street as ecstasy actually contained MDMA. So with the spread of MDMA across the country, it didn't take long for the DEA to catch wind and move to schedule it. So now we're July 27th, 1984, and the DEA announced they intended to place MDMA on Schedule 1, which means there's no current accepted medical use in the same category as heroin. So the DEA at the time thought they were just going to schedule it and it wasn't going to be a big deal. But I actually found a New York Times article that wrote that the DEA was flooded with letters from angry psychiatrists and therapists who challenged the DEA's research and classification procedures. They were outraged that the DEA would virtually eliminate all research and clinical use of the drug, and they demanded a public hearing. And who was behind all this? It was our guy Rick. So he's the one that actually found the attorney to take the case pro bono to file hearings against the DEA. So the MDMA scheduled hearings began in 1984, and there was 2 years of testimony from both sides. So on one side, the DEA said that MDMA caused brain damage, it had a high potential for abuse, it had no medicinal purpose, and that it was spreading rampant across the nation. Then on the other side, there were the proponents for MDMA, psychiatrists, therapists, and Rick specifically, and they quoted, "Given the amount of millions of users, the resulting negative medical and social consequences was infinitesimal, that it had a low potential for abuse and a high potential for therapeutic use." So the judge had to answer two questions when making his ruling. Number one, could it be accepted for medical use? And number two, can it be administered safely under medical supervision? So after 2 years of testimony from both sides, Judge Francis Young gave a 71-page decision. In the ruling, Judge Young quoted extensively from testimony of dozens of highly trained psychiatrists and rules that it was acceptable for medical use. He quotes, "Good medical practice and patient interest thus require that physicians be free to use drugs according to their best knowledge and judgment." So question number one, answered by the judge, was a thumbs up. So then he went on to say, "The doses of MDMA administered therapeutically by a psychiatrist to patients have been less than 1% of the legal dose, while drugs used for general anesthesia administer as much as 50% of a lethal dose." He also said that the FDA has approved the daily use of fenfluramine, which at the time was a diet pill. But this proven neurotoxic substance is only a Schedule 4. So on the second question, is this safe to administer under medical supervision, Judge Young wrote, "High margin of safety with MDMA when it is used in treatment." Another thumbs up. So now I'm going to read to you Judge Young's final conclusion as it sums up his thought process and how he reached this decision. So he says, "Because MDMA cannot be patented, no pharmaceutical company has had the financial incentive to carry out the extensive animal and clinical tests required by the FDA. Nevertheless, the overwhelming weight of medical opinion, evidence received in the proceeding concurred that sufficient information on MDMA existed to support a judgment by reputable physicians that MDMA was safe to use under medical supervision. The administrative law judge finds that the evidence of record requires MDMA to be placed on Schedule 3. So this was a huge victory for the MDMA proponents and for Rick himself, who had been fighting for this. So Schedule 3 is important because that means that it's currently accepted medical use, and most importantly, it would allow research studies to be performed on the chemical. But not so fast. So in the end, the DEA did what it wanted and scheduled MDMA as Schedule 1 and locked it up forever. Whoop. Locked up with his buddy El Señor Heroin, who's also Schedule 1. But you know what's interesting is, guess who isn't locked up and is running around willy-nilly and comes and visits us in EPS every single day? This guy. Little old meth man. Only Schedule 2. So Rick was devastated but he wasn't giving up when this happened. So in 1986, he founded MAPS, which stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And I'm going to read to you MAPS's mission statement. A world where psychedelics and marijuana are safely and legally available for beneficial uses, and where research is governed by rigorous scientific evaluation and benefits. So one of the ongoing debates linked to MDMA is if it is neurotoxic. So now I'm going to go quickly through various articles that make the debate pretty confusing. So the first one I came across was Vollenweider et al., And they wrote effects of MDMA on 5-HT uptake sites using PET. And their conclusion was that it's extremely unlikely that a moderate dose of MDMA leads to neurotoxic damage, long-term changes in 5-HT uptake sites. Next is Bola et al., and they wrote, greater use of MDMA was associated with greater impairments in immediate verbal memory and delayed visual memory. Next we have Gamma, who wrote, no difference in brain activation during cognitive performance between ecstasy users and controls. Then Ricarte, 1999, altered serotonin innervation patterns in the forebrains of monkey treated with MDMA 7 years previously. But of note, in this study, they used MDMA 3 times the recreational dose, twice a day for 4 days in a row on these monkeys, which is a huge amount of MDMA. McCann et al., 1999, MDMA subjects had significant performance deficits on a sustained attention task requiring complex attention. So all the previous articles had a confounding factor in that none of the MDMA users just used MDMA. They also used other drugs, they also drank alcohol, so there's no clear link that any of these studies could show that the results were linked specifically to MDMA. So Halpern et al. Noticed these deficits and was able to find a subculture in the Mormon community, and they only used MDMA and never used any other drugs. So he found these subjects, and he wrote, in a study designed to minimize limitations found in many prior investigations, we failed to demonstrate marked residual cognitive effects in ecstasy users. This finding contrasts with many previous findings, including our own, and emphasizes the need for continued caution in interpreting field studies of cognitive function in illicit ecstasy users. In 2002, there was a big blow to the proponents for MDMA and therapy. Science magazine or Science journal published Ricarte et al. Severe dopaminergic neurotoxicity in primates after a common recreational dose regimen of MDMA. So when this came out, it was a huge deal because people read this as this is dopamine toxic. So dopamine is important to Parkinson's. So that means that MDMA causes Parkinson's disease. So that was like what people just ran off with. And the study didn't mention this at all, but that was sort of like the word on the street. And at that time, Rick was starting to develop the protocol for the first MDMA PTSD study. And when this article was published, the IRB sent a terminate immediately to Rick's initial study. So I want you guys to, I put a little star next to NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, so I want you guys to remember that. But again, not so fast. So 1 year later, that article was retracted by Science magazine because the drug used to treat all but one animal came from a bottle that contained D-methamphetamine. So the drug, proven to be terribly neurotoxic, resulted to be a drug that was already a prescribed medication. 11 days later, the IRB retracted their terminate immediately and allowed Rick and his organization MAPS to begin the first study of its kind for MDMA psychotherapy and persistent PTSD. So in 2000, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, launched a countrywide campaign to spread the word that MDMA causes holes in the brain. So I remember these ads running on MTV. I remember the Oprah show, there was a huge deal about this, and they would use this image, and it was sort of this is your brain on drugs, this is your brain after ecstasy. And they claimed that after only one recreational use, that it would cause holes to develop in your brain. So they ran this on billboards, advertisements, and it was spread throughout the country. So I asked myself, where did NIDA get these images, and where are the famous holes that they claim? So the study that NIDA cites and whose images they use in their campaign came from an article published by Linda Chang et al., Effect of MDMA on Cerebral Blood Flow, a co-registered SPECT and MRI study. So this study, it took MDMA users, gave them different dosages of MDMA, and then rescanned their brains 2 weeks later and compared these to people who had never used MDMA. So you're thinking to yourself, the result of this study must be pretty astounding, that NIDA would launch a national health campaign, right? So let's take a look at the results from this study. So I'm going to read this to you. All MDMA users and normal control subjects had normal MRI with no focal brain lesions. After co-registration of each SPECT and the corresponding intra-subject MRI and partial volume correction, the global cerebral blood flow in the abstinent MDMA users was only 2.3% lower compared to the matched control subjects. In the individual regions, MDMA users showed mild but not significant reductions in cerebral blood flow compared to the control subjects. And so look at the p-value, 0.64. So let's just pause there for a second and think about that. So let's look at the images again. So we'll take a look at the famous campaign poster. And in doing my research, the scientific community has now called this this campaign a complete farce, as the normal brain is a brain at baseline before MDMA use. So this baseline that they use in the poster is actually from the brain of an MDMA user who had used at least 211 times. So their normal brain is someone who'd used MDMA that much. And the holes were actually areas of decreased blood flow. And remember that in the study, that was not statistically significant from control. Then if you look at that the top two pictures there, you'll see that subject was given 4.75 milligrams per kilogram of MDMA, which is almost 3 times a recreational dose. And then if you look at the bottom brain scan there, that subject was given 2.25, and that's around the recreational dose. And you can see there's very little, they're almost identical from baseline to 2 weeks after. So again, let's pause and think about this national campaign that was launched based on this study. So my feelings are met by Spider-Man there. So what are the current thoughts on neurotoxicity? So after going through all these studies, I came upon the conclusion that heavy ecstasy users might reflect 5-HT neurotoxicity, although alternative explanations, downregulation of the SERT cannot be excluded. So it might be neurotoxic in heavy chronic use. So deaths from MDMA are mostly caused by heat stroke, hyponatremia, and not taking MDMA. So what do you mean not taking MDMA? And that's because people are given lethal adulterants sold as MDMA. So from 2009 to 2014, there was a huge rate of overdoses of people taking MDMA. And Dr. Campbell was awesome and actually told me the reason why this occurred. So there was an international crackdown on the illegal logging in Cambodia. And so these illegal loggers would go into the forest and they'd get these trees and they would extract safrole, which is one of the main ingredients used to produce MDMA. So this led to a global shortage in 2008. So there wasn't enough safrole. So then the underground chemists were like, well, we're selling all this stuff and we still need to sell these pills, so we're just going to put other stuff in it and sell it as MDMA. So they would put in mephedrone, PMAA, which those can be lethal in high doses. And in my research, I came across the information that by 2009, most ecstasy pills contain less than 3% MDMA, if any at all. So it's kind of, Dr. Campbell and I were talking about this sort of a butterfly effect, that something happened all the way in Cambodia, and then all these deaths started happening around Europe. And one of the most notable deaths was 3 people died taking the Superman MDMA pill. But when they actually did the studies on this pill, it contained PMAA, which is extremely toxic and lethal at high doses, and the pills contain little to no MDMA. So we'll look at the number of emergency department visits for drug misabuse or abuse on average day from people aged 18 to 25. So this is in 2011. At the top, I don't know if you guys can see that, but that's alcohol in combination with other drugs. Then marijuana was pretty high up there, which I was surprised about. And then you have the narcotics, benzos, and then way down, second to last, you have MDMA, LSD, PCP, and other hallucinogens all lumped in together. So I don't know how like PCP and MDMA can be lumped in the same category. It's kind of saying that a panda and like a wolverine are the same animal. It's kind of like, so now we traveled to the late 2009. So what was going on in my life? So I was living in Brooklyn at the time. I was living the starving artist life. Look at that haircut. So that mullet was actually only on one side. It was just on the side, which was big in Argentina. And my brother called it the fun side. So you're asking yourself, what happened? This innocent young child, look at him. So that's what happens when you take a boy out of California and make him go to school in the cold Northeast. So I was doing a lot of painting at the time, and I made this painting for my buddy at Williams College, who was on the soccer team, who commissioned me. His favorite player was Maradona, and so he's like, oh, you gotta make me a painting of Maradona. And so I made this for him, and he still hasn't paid me for the painting. So while this was going on, Rick Doblin and MAPS paved the way for FDA trials for MDMA. So in 2010, he teams up with Dr. Mithofer, and through a grueling IRB and FDA approval process, completes and publishes the results of an FDA Phase 2 trial on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant PTSD. All right, so let's take a look at the study. So the title of the study is The Safety and Efficacy of MDMA-Assisted Psychotherapy in Subjects with Chronic Treatment-Resistant PTSD, the first randomized controlled pilot study. So this was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and it was the most downloaded article from this journal in 2010. So the subjects, they had to meet DSM criteria for PTSD and were to have resistant treatments. So what does that mean, resistant symptoms? So what does that mean, resistant symptoms? So they had to have a CAP score of greater than 50, signifying moderate to severe symptoms, and they had to have had at least 3 months of SSRI or SNRI treatment, along with 6 months of psychotherapy. So psychopharmacology plus therapy, and they were still having severe symptoms of PTSD. So the design of the study was a randomized, double-blind fashion. There were 2 experimental sessions of either psychotherapy with MDMA or same psychotherapy with a placebo. And then all the subjects who initially received the placebo were offered participation in an open-label crossover study once the first part of the study was done. So I'll explain it better in the next slide with this diagram. So this is a diagram of the study design. So in the beginning, patients were screened, and then they had a couple of prep sessions, and then they had their first experimental session, and they would either get MDMA or they would get placebo, and then they would have kind of an integrative session after that, and then they would have their second experimental session. And then the blind was broken. This is where the blind was broken, and then subjects who had just received the placebo the first 2 times, they could opt in and go back and do the first 2 experimental sessions with MDMA. But for the study results, it's all in the blind. So for the study, like when they did all the statistics and everything, it was before the blind was broken. So this is a picture of the typical setup for the MDMA sessions. So patients relax in a comfortable lounge chair, and you would have 2 therapists by the patient's side. So this is an excerpt from the study's methods section. So they would take their dose of MDMA or a placebo, and they would usually take it around 10 a.m., and subjects then rested in a comfortable position with eyes closed or wearing eye shades. They listened to a program of music that was initially relaxing and later emotionally evocative. The programs of music were identical for all subjects. Those subjects or investigators could choose to skip over some selections or to replace them with periods of silence. So these therapy sessions would last on average around 8 hours. And through the process, either subjects just had the blinds on and listen to music, and whenever they had a revelation, they would take off the blinds and they would talk to the therapist, and this would go on for about 8 hours. And the therapeutic approach standardized for the study was that of empathic presence. So empathic presence includes providing a non-judgmental environment which offers psychological permission to talk openly and honestly. There's minimal encouragement, invitation rather than direction. There's a lot of paraphrasing, reflecting, emotional labeling, and you would allow participants to come to conclusions themselves. They would also use non-directive communication, such as "we encourage you to," or "this might be a good time to do this." So in that way, it was very like reassuring, and you would just wait, and you wouldn't pressure someone into talking about something that they weren't ready to talk about. So this is the range of doses explored in the MAPS phase 2 MDMA studies. So they found that the most effective dosage range was somewhere between 75 and 125 milligrams. So the outcome was measured by the CAPS, which is the Clinician-Administered PTSD Scale. And in essence, the CAPS follows the DSM criteria for PTSD. So you have to have 1 intrusive symptom, 1 avoidant symptom, 2 mood-altering symptoms, 2 hyperarousal symptoms. And then it has to have lasted for at least a month and caused significant distress or functional impairment. So the participants would rate 5 symptoms from each of the criteria on a scale from 0 to 5. So someone could get a total possible score of 100 on a CAPS. All right, so you're probably thinking, I haven't seen any graphs yet. Is it grand rounds count if there's no graphs? So you guys are put you at ease here. So this is the results of the placebo group. So as you can see, at baseline, all the participants started around 80, which is a pretty high CAPS score. So for the placebo group, on average, they dropped after 2 sessions. They went from 80 all the way to 60. And this in itself was clinically significant. But remember, the placebo group wasn't just placebo. They actually had 8 hours of psychotherapy, which in itself is pretty remarkable. Well, now let's take a look at the MDMA group. So for reference, moderate to severe PTSD is shown by this arrow at 50. And you can see that on average, the people that took MDMA group went from a baseline around 80 to 25.5 only after 2 sessions of MDMA psychotherapy. And what really struck me is if you just look at after 1 session right here. So after 1 session, they dropped from 80 to almost right below 40, which is unbelievable. And so you're thinking to yourself, that's incredible. So I was thinking, well, what about our first line treatments that we have these days? I mean, they must be pretty good, right? Because they're first line, and that's what we use to treat people with PTSD. So there are 2 SSRIs approved for PTSD, Paxil and Zoloft. So Zoloft was the first medicine to achieve approval for PTSD in 1999. It had 4 12-week placebo-controlled studies, and only 2 of those studies showed Zoloft to correlate with significant improvement from placebo, with only a 7-point difference from placebo on the CAPS score. And remember, in the last slide, MDMA had a 35-point difference from placebo. And in these studies, Zoloft was only clinically significant in females, and it only became significant at week 12, where with the MDMA study, only after 1 session, it was already clinically significant. So I went and I found the original FDA review of Zoloft for the indication of PTSD. And the medical reviewer writes, "The sponsor did not demonstrate efficacy in the full population that was intended. The efficacy they demonstrated was in a subpopulation, females. This drug is currently available for use, and I see no need to grant new indication that is not fully proven for both men and women." Dr. Earl Hurst, September 1999. Well, lo and behold, Pfizer's Zoloft receives FDA approval for PTSD 2 months later. So I was asking myself, like, how does this happen? And the only explanation I have is Zoloft made Pfizer $3.3 billion in 2005. So all the little Zoloft blobs are pretty happy, a little party there. So let's go back to the MDMA phase 2 trials. So we'll review the results in more detail. So for the study, the clinical response was defined as greater than 30% reduction from baseline in total CAP score. So in stage 1 of the study, the clinical response in the MDMA group was 83% versus only 25% in the placebo group. In stage 2, so stage 2 means those participants who got the placebo first, they went back and they did 2 sessions with MDMA. And the clinical response was 100%, as the 7 subjects who had failed to respond with placebo all had successful outcomes with MDMA. In addition, there were no drug-related serious adverse events and no evidence of impaired cognitive function as measured by neuropsychological testing. So some of you may be thinking, so what? That was only 2 months after they did the trial, so is there any longevity to this? So they did a specific study just for that. The durability of improvement in PTSD symptoms and absence of harmful effects on drug dependency after MDMA assisted psychotherapy, a prospective long-term follow-up study. So let's look at the results from this long-term follow-up study. So again, these are the same exact patients from the previous study that I talked about. And remember that the average CAPS at baseline was 80. At the end of the first study, so after only 2 MDMA sessions, their average CAPS score, where it says study exit, was 25. Then they went and found the subjects later on, and on average, they were surveyed at 3.5 years later, and the CAP score on average was 24.6. So it actually decreased after 3.5 years, which is pretty incredible. So why does MDMA therapy cause such a dramatic and long-lasting effect? So in essence, it's a exposure therapy. It's asking someone to talk about a traumatic event and able to process what occurred. So Fo et al. Wrote, to be effective, exposure must be accompanied by a degree of emotional engagement or fear activation, while avoiding dissociation or overwhelming emotion. So this has been referred to as working within the optimal arousal zone or the window of tolerance. So here we have a diagram illustrating the therapeutic window of tolerance. The line at the top is the high arousal. So when crossing that line, leads someone to have a fight or a flight response. And then at the bottom, there's the hypoarousal line. And this is when you cross into that line, it causes numbness. It causes patients to dissociate and not be engaged. So what happens is someone's going along through therapy and they're talking about an event and a process, and then something comes up and it's just too much, and they get into that fight or flight response and they can no longer engage in therapy, and it's no longer productive. So with MDMA by a patient's side, the window of tolerance is expanded. So MDMA allows patients to stay emotionally engaged without being overwhelmed by anxiety while revisiting traumatic experiences. It may thereby catalyze effective exposure therapy. So in a sense, MDMA increases awareness while at the same time lowering anxiety. So I think this is key. So this is very crucial, because usually a medication that increases awareness causes someone to become anxious and paranoid, and then a drug that lowers anxiety causes someone to just be relaxed and not aware. But MDMA is unique in that it increases awareness while at the same time lowering anxiety, which I think is the key. Additionally, when someone takes MDMA, you have a huge release of oxytocin, and findings suggest that oxytocin is involved in affiliation, trust, and accurate perceptions of emotion. So the accurate perception of emotion is something that we try to do with our patients all the time, and try to label how they feel. And by having this on board as well, it really helps people become emotionally engaged. So now we're in 2012, and what was going on in my life in 2012? Well, my brother Gustavo was nominated for a Grammy in 2012. He's looking pretty good there. So you ask yourself, why does he look so good? And it's because our mom dressed him up. And if she can design and make dresses for Sophia Loren, then my brother is probably in good hands. And then there's the black sheep of the family that went to med school. So at Thanksgiving dinners, my brother would always be like, "But you haven't been nominated for a Grammy." And it's like, failure. So it's around 2011, 2012. Now let's meet probably the most important member of the Tale of Three Journeys, James Casey. So James is deployed to Afghanistan. In 2011, he serves as an Army medic, and in 2012, he is honorably discharged. So that's him in the bottom right there. So James was diagnosed with PTSD in 2012, and he said, "I felt like I wasn't allowed to have PTSD. A lot of people in the military treat it as if it were a medal or a badge of honor to be won, and who wants to win that? And when I came out and did say I had PTSD, I lost a lot of friends. I had one former friend who told me I was a disgrace to the uniform and that he was ashamed that he ever served with me." So let's listen now to James' story. The following clip is from a mini documentary called Psychedelic Soldiers. It truly captures the struggle and the pain that our veterans suffer after coming home from war, and many are left without treatments that help them. And I'm going to warn you guys that there are some graphic images in the video and some graphic topics discussed as well.
My dog Dash, I mean, we got her when she was a puppy because I thought it helped me with, my issues. I would choke her until her eyes would roll to the back of her head, and then I'd let go, at the last minute. I would fantasize and talk to my friend about how I was wanting to kill her and make it look like an accident so my wife wouldn't freak out. And I just had this anger over something that didn't deserve it. Even at that point, I didn't even realize I had a problem. I remember this one lady, I think she was an interpreter. The bones in her hands were like poking out of her fingers, kind of like you forcefully stick your hand through an old glove almost. One leg was completely the other way around, and she kept saying, if one of my legs is messed up, or if I'm losing a leg, let me die. It was just a really surreal experience. I mean, I can't even go in to describe it. It's just, I don't know. And it's still like, I just kind of shut myself off at that point.
James was always just such an outgoing person. Once PTSD kind of sets in, like, you don't even know who you're married to anymore.
I was so numb I couldn't feel emotions. I didn't know how to retrieve them anymore. It was to the point where I knew I loved my wife with all my heart, but I couldn't feel it.
I was afraid because I was pregnant a year ago. I was like, is my husband even going to be able to connect with his baby? What am I doing here? It's like, I don't think this is going to get better.
I felt very weak. I mean, these were my own issues I was battling, and I couldn't get past them. And I was just angry that I was not making myself better. I was angry because I know the doctor down the street's not going to do anything. I know these meds aren't going to do anything. It's all me. I went on the MAPS website and I just started looking at all these different research studies going on across the country. Then I saw Boulder, Colorado. Holy crap, that's where I was wanting to go to college. That's where I want to move when I get out.
When my husband tells me that he wants to take ecstasy in a study, I'm like, you're crazy.
MDMA is stigmatized as this party drug. When I say Molly, when I say ecstasy, people think of kids doing it at raves, kids doing it at clubs, parties, etc., etc.
MDMA is the active ingredient in what's commonly known as ecstasy. What people are getting on the streets, what people are doing in raves, may or may not have MDMA in it. Oftentimes it doesn't. What we're using in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research is pure pure MDMA made by a chemist in a lab. People with PTSD have nervous systems that are totally shot. So anything can set them off, anything can trigger them because they're so activated all the time. They're living in the part of the brain that's meant to just protect us from danger. You can't talk through that. You can't just think your way out of it, which is what traditional therapy would work with. So in an ordinary state of consciousness, someone would think about the trauma, and they would dissociate, they would check out, they would get numb because it's too intense to think about. And MDMA supports them in looking at it and staying with it long enough to actually process it.
They wanted me to take the medicine and kind of let the medicine guide the experience. And I'd take it, lay down, and as soon as it started to kick in, I kind of just start verbalizing my thoughts and start kind of wading through the waters of my subconscious and my PTSD. Each MDMA session was played its own instrumental part in getting better. It was really amazing. The first session was identifying the problem, and then my kind of question leading into the second session was, if I identify that problem, okay, cool, what now? It was kind of talking about what now, like what do I do after I identify these problems. And the third session was feeling that emotion and bringing that love outwards towards my family and friends and to the world and to the environment. With MDMA, with that armor, and with that it felt like love coming out of every single cell of my body. I was curious and I was wanting to make myself better. And with that armor on me, I could do any of that stuff. I could climb that wall and get over and access my heart and see what that wall was made of, And it was really amazing.
Hearing what he was talking about and then how he was trying to fix that in his life, like I was able to see him starting to kind of open up and be more able to communicate. And I think at that point, that's when I kind of let go of all my bad stereotypes about it.
We get prescribed SSRIs, different medications and different treatments. It's a recurring process. So you got to take these pills daily, or you got to go to these appointments every week, every month, what have you. But the interesting thing about these MDMA sessions is it's only 3 sessions, give or take, and that's it. So during the MDMA sessions, I realized that to get better, to help myself, I don't need to like fireworks. I don't need to watch these war movies. I expect so much to be James before deployment that I can just be James after deployment.
2.5 years ago, I would have just prayed for him to be able to actually look at me and say, I love you, and actually be able to feel it and to know that he meant it. Today I have so much more than that.
Wow, so that's pretty incredible, right? It's awesome that James was able to share his story in that documentary. Just kind of very compelling. So now we've traveled more to the present, and now we're in April 2017, and I'm in Oakland, California with these 2 beautiful men. Look at that, look at their hair. That's when I called them my Muppets. But, So we went to the Psychedelic Science Conference 2017, which was put on by MAPS and by Rick Doblin specifically. This is like his baby. So now we're here in 2017, and this is where the tale of 3 journeys finally collide. So it was after a day of conferences, and Johnny and Eric and I were walking through the hotel lobby, going back to our Airbnb, and we see Rick Doblin standing there, and he's like the big celebrity at this thing. Every time we see him, there's news cameras, there's people talking to him, and we see him, and there's only a couple of people around him, and so we're like, oh man, we gotta go say hi to Rick. So we go up to him, and we introduce ourselves, and we thank him for putting on the conference, and he's extremely gracious and nice, and then we told him we were from Kentucky, and he was blown away by that. He was like, Kentucky. Um, yeah, he just like laughed. Um, but as we said goodbye, we noticed that there was a young man standing next to us who was wearing a "Say No to Drugs" shirt, and it was James. And then we saw James go up to Rick and introduce himself, and Rick was just kind of, he had this look, and they gave each other like a big hug, and at that time, like, we thought that they must have known each other or something. So then the next day we went to another conference, and we were standing in line waiting to meet Dr. Mithofer, who was the lead investigator in the phase 2 FDA trials for MDMA. And we were standing in line, and this guy, who was James, was standing right next to us. And so I was like, hey, man, weren't you there last night with Rick? And he was like, yeah, that was me. And I was like, you guys know each other? And he was like, no, that was the first time we ever met. And I was like, wow. And then James told us that he was a veteran and that he enrolled in the Boulder study for PTSD, MDMA. And he basically told us that he wouldn't be standing there if it wasn't for MDMA, and that it basically saved his life. And he said that after he went through the study that he wrote Rick Dobin a letter, and that was like 3 years before that day. And he said that after he met Rick Dobin and they like hugged, like Rick Dobin reached into his pocket and like brought out the letter that, sorry. It was just really cool to see. So, I practice this. So, it was just like so touching to see that, and meeting James personally and hearing his story was like, man, like this is incredible, and just to like be able to witness that was really cool. Sorry. So now we go to August 31st, 2017, and the FDA designates MDMA as a breakthrough therapy for PTSD. So this is amazing. Going into the FDA phase 3 clinical trials. So right now there are 2 ongoing randomized double-blind placebo-controlled multi-site clinical trials that assess the safety and efficacy of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So this is awesome. It's going to have 200 to 300 participants with severe PTSD. Sorry. So there's also some ongoing studies with different psychedelics, which is pretty cool. There's MDMA with anxiety with life-threatening illness. There's psilocybin with advanced stage cancer, and also there's social anxiety in autistic adults with MDMA, which I thought was pretty cool too. So what a journey we've been on. Thank you guys so much for taking it with me. So we started in 1912, back in the Merck lab when Kolsch first synthesized MDMA. Then it was sort of lost to the world, and it wasn't until Sasha Shulgin rediscovered it and took it for the first time in 1976. And then in 1983, I was born, and in 1986, MDMA was labeled as a Schedule I drug, leading to Rick Doblin to found MAPS and fight for the use of psychedelics to help those in suffering. Then in the late 80s and into the 90s, MDMA found its home in the rave scene, and a campaign was launched claiming MDMA caused holes in the brain. And then in 2010, Rick, along with Dr. Mithofer, published the first study of its kind on the use of MDMA and PTSD. In 2011, James was deployed to Afghanistan and upon return diagnosed with PTSD and was in a downward spiral before enrolling in the MDMA clinical trials in 2014. In 2017, our 3 journeys came to one as we met in Oakland and the FDA designated MDMA as a breakthrough therapy. So looking to the future, as MDMA heads into stage 3 clinical trials, it is estimated that by 2021, MDMA one day be prescribed by psychiatrists to assist in healing the pain of those who have suffered for far too long. Thank you all so much. You guys have been awesome. it. So I open up to questions or comments. Yeah, Laura. Yeah, it's a drawing I did called Birds That Fly. Yeah, so for the study, all participants had to be weaned off any psychotropics that they were on um, for just that risk. But I was actually did my research. There are studies that say that when someone is on an SSRI and they take MDMA, it actually blocks the effects. And then there are also ongoing studies, like in rats, that show that SSRIs may block some of the neurotoxic effects that high dosages may cause. Um, but there is like the theoretical theory that taking this with an SSRI may lead to serotonin syndrome for sure. Hey, Dr. Campbell.
I got a bunch of stuff to tell you.
Yeah.
One, my background, my interest, my scientific interest, my interest in MDMA came in Miami because when I was a cardiothoracic fellow in Jackson, it was a massive 2,000 bed hospital right in the center of probably one of the highest per square mile electronic dance club areas in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I went there in the 80s and the early 90s, and when I was there, I used to moonlight. There was 5 emergency rooms there, plus the trauma center, and I would either be in the surgery ER or the medicine ER. Well, all of the MDMA so-called overdoses that came in to the medicine ER. So I mean, because much of the toxicity comes from an almost instantaneous serotonin response. So I actually was able to see literally dozens of cases in 2 years of serotonin syndrome, more than I'll ever see the rest of my career.
Wow.
And being managed that. And virtually all of them, we were able to, the ones that survived, and many of them truly did die of severe hypothermia and cardiovascular.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that survived, all of them that got that had super therapeutic doses. We're talking about they would start out with a 500 milligram tablet of MDMA, if it was even a routine.
Mm-hmm.
And then they do what is called stacking. Halfway through, before even the effects even begin to work, they take another one. Because stacking with MDMA gives you a profound surge, okay? And what that surge is, it's all that serotonin that's still left over. And so, and these guys, these people are, for drug users, are pretty savvy. One, they would take an antidepressant, an SSRI, if it was Prozac, and that's because it's a PGY4 inhibitor. Well, that's exactly how MDMA is metabolized.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't take one that didn't have that. But one of the other PGY4 inhibitors that is very common and maybe discounted is the PGY4 inhibitor. Okay? And lastly, if they were going to drink a drink, it'd be a salty dog, because guess what? Straight fructose is a PGY4 inhibitor.
Mm-hmm.
They do all of this stuff. Where they got into trouble were some of them that didn't have the background was tried to synthesize and settle the keyboard. So it was actually the PGA that you talked about that was still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And lastly, let's take a personal note with you. The people in the movie that I made back in 2008 with my friend Joey, called No Kidding Me Too, where there's a Master Sergeant Joe Santiago that's profile in there. He was the lead Humvee into Iraq right after 2008. He had sustained a bad head injury that had severe PTSD. I've kept up with him, and since we made that movie, we've gone through MDMA psychotherapy at virtually no.
Wow, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing. Dr. Lippman?
I think you did a wonderful job of very amazing speaker. But one caution on you, don't jump on the bandwagon because just like you criticize the serotonin study, well, people, 3 months they got anything.
Yeah.
This study, things that have been better for him, maybe that's the cure of the world. But don't get on the bandwagon too quick. But also talk a little bit about ketamine, which is an antagonist to NMDA.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Wright?
A great thought. I was just wondering about the mechanism of action that people have been working on this research. What I think is the MDMA itself is somehow helping to PTSD, and whether it's MDMA is making some kind of a really advanced and highly effective exposure that takes therapy work. Fix that happen.
Yeah.
So, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the key is that MDMA itself is not the treatment. If you just give someone MDMA and they sat there and didn't have the therapy, I don't think they would get better. I think the key is that it that it widens that window of tolerance and then allows people to have effective psychotherapy. So in itself, MDMA is not the cure, but I think it's a catalyst that is the cure to help. But psychotherapy is still the main key component.
Just make one comment. There's been a lot of interest in whether combined pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy works better than either monotherapy alone. And if you look at the vast amount of research, for depression, the answer is probably yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
For anxiety disorders, probably not with standard SSRI.
Yeah.
This kind of work, and there's some other work on what's called phencyclopyrimidine, which is an antibiotic.
Mm.
It's used for tuberculosis, and there's some evidence that that promotes exposure therapy. So we may be entering into a new era where we're looking at specific drugs that are not classic antidepressants or benzodiazepines that will really help people that work with psychotherapy.
Awesome.
That's very good.
Thank you. Dr. Casey?
Yeah, congratulations. Wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I have lots of reactions to that before you all. You and I have talked about a number of these things before.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Whitman is correct. Rick Dolan is he's a proponent. He's not really a neutral observer anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to look to see what are the effects that happen with this gentleman and other people are generalizing or not.
Exactly.
In the early stages of his treatment, typically the people that do well speak out. We don't really know about the people that
Mm-hmm.
reserve judgment until we actually see the results of more substantial scientific work. Having said that, there is a lot of interest in this general topic, not just with MDMA, but also with LSD.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason that that's fascinating to me is that we had a faculty member here in the 1970s named Herman Denver, who was quite a famous pharmacologist. He's done most of his original work in New York and some of it in Europe. He was one of the first LSD researchers in the United States. That was really his main interest, was the application of LSD in psychotherapy.
Oh.
And that work ended at that time with his work and a few others, but it's been resurrected. You may have seen the article in the New York Times a few months ago about a patient who's overdosed with LSD. Not enough to really have a psychedelic effect, but it did facilitate her psychotherapy for chronic depression she had been under. We'll have to wait and see what happens, but it seems to be an area of research from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dr. Casey. Laura? Mm-hmm. No, so I think most of them were just trained in the therapeutic approach that was standardized for the studies. But actually, right now, there's a study going on where they're giving the MDMA to future therapists that will be trained for I think it was the ones that are going to do the clinical 3 trials. So they're doing a study with the therapists, giving them MDMA so that they do see what it's like, how they feel. So it's a good question. Dr. Wong?
Yes, Pablo, I really enjoyed this talk. A couple of questions. First one is, I think your statement of basically these labs, the curative of activity.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you see this kind of consistent side effects of stable effectively relative consistent of that? And do you see the same potential side effects of personality and feedback? And then the second question is sort of what substitute therapy is doing for and sort of aside from your PGY, you were talking about antidepressants,
Yeah, so I think the side effect profile is vastly different based on what is in quote unquote an ecstasy pill. Um, so most from what I was researching, people know within like half an hour or an hour if they got quote unquote a good pill, because either they won't feel that rush and they'll feel more paranoid. They won't have the jaw clenching, and they get more hot. And with PMA, which is the one that they usually adulterate with, people get extremely hyperthermic, and so that's something that's pretty lethal. And then on your second question, I think the focus is on trauma. So the focus is to be able to address the trauma instead of running away from it. So with the MDMA, like James was saying in the video, you feel like you have an armor to finally face all this stuff that happened to you. So so as I was reading in the articles, when a patient was coming close to to talking about something, the therapist would not force them to think about it, but when you're ready, like go back in and just start talking to us. What do you see? What do you feel? So there is guiding someone towards approaching the trauma and confronting it, and then most importantly, being able to process it. Dr. Casey?
When I was training, I did some work with the Indian Health Service,
Mhm.
and I worked on a reservation in Montana where the Native American Church was very prominent in the use of plant-based psychedelics, mescaline, psilocybin, or other, of course, originally.
Mm.
One thing I observed is that the way that people interpret and react to psychedelic experiences is highly context-driven.
Mhm.
In that context, it would be a very constructive experience. Having grown up in the 60s and 70s, I know a lot of other people that have had very destructive experiences from some of the very same substances. So it's interesting to see how that psychotherapy might be very different than the experience that someone might do.
Yeah, the importance of setting, like who you're with and the setting that you're around is very important. Dr. Campbell?
So a common scenario is that you go to a club and you are not a knowledgeable guy and you take a superman. Try and go to the superman. You don't want to have anything to do with it. So you take that and an hour later, this is not doing anything for me. So your friend who really has MDMA gives you one. Well, what happens is MDMA profoundly has a synergistic effect with PGA, and it isn't that it makes it better. It makes the PGA even worse.
Mm.
So people become
I see. Yeah.
Number two is that in 1914, 2 years after this was synthesized, Polish actually gave a friend of his in Germany who was a psychotherapist a little bit of MDMA, and he used it on a patient. And I can't give you the citing all
Yeah.
I read it somewhere. And that is, some psychotherapist said, by the end of the first session, by the end of the session with him, he had repeated sessions. This guy would not open up. He said he had, in the word was utterances, leading me into a totally different area that I would have, unfortunately for him, he couldn't get it.
Yeah. Wow.
And then lastly, Dr. Whitman was talking, and it was very important, like jumping on the bandwagon.
Mhm.
Well, in 1957, Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA,
Mhm.
all this work about finding the spiritual enlightenment had not yet really found the spiritual enlightenment himself. And one of his good friends was Aldous Huxley, the great author. The two of them, under medical supervision, took LSD together, and Bill Wilson's profound effect from that was, this is the cure for alcoholism.
Mm.
Maybe we just call it a relapse.
Oh, thanks.
Well, I think we're up against time, so thank you once again for the wonderful presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Telling a story in EPS, I go, well, like I said, when I talked to Sergeant Joe the last time, he was basically like a COVID. His only problems he has now are really the residuals from his PGY, but not the flashbacks or that nightmares. Joey make a movie about that. Take care.